The rifle was still warm. The man holding it had been dead for 6 hours. A Japanese officer crouched in the jungle darkness of Guadalcanal, staring at the American position across the tree line. He had led his men through 3 charges that night. 3 times they had been thrown back, not by artillery, not by aircraft, by men, by Marines who refused to break. He picked up his field journal and wrote something that night that would have shocked Tokyo. He wrote that these Americans were not like the soldiers his commanders had described. They did not run, they did not surrender. They fought like men who had made a decision long before the battle started, a decision that no jungle, no darkness, no human wave could undo. That officer's name was Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, and within 48 hours he would be dead. His entire regiment, over 900 men, nearly wiped from existence, destroyed not by superior numbers, but by a force of Marines who had been awake for days, half-starved, and holding a perimeter with rifles and sheer will. This is the story of what Japanese commanders actually thought about the United States Marines, not the propaganda, not the official reports sent to Tokyo, the real thoughts, the private fears, the confessions written in captured journals and spoken in post-war testimonies, because what they said, quietly, reluctantly, changed how historians understand the entire Pacific War. It is August 1942. The world is watching the Pacific with dread. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan controls an empire stretching from the coast of China to the islands of the Central Pacific. Their military machine is moving fast, striking hard, and winning almost everywhere it turns. The Japanese soldier is widely considered the finest light infantryman in the world, disciplined, fanatical, willing to die on command. Their commanders genuinely believe, that no Western force has the psychological endurance to match the Japanese warrior spirit, what they call Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan. American forces are still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The Army is rebuilding, the Navy is licking its wounds from catastrophic losses, and the Marines, the United States Marine Corps, are being sent to a disease-soaked, jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain called Guadalcanal. Their mission is to take an airfield the Japanese are building and hold it against everything. The Japanese High Command is not worried, not at first. Their intelligence reports describe American fighting men as soft, comfortable, men raised on wealth and ease who would falter when pushed beyond their limits. Japanese officers had watched American forces retreat in the Philippines. They had seen the fall of Wake Island, the surrender at Bataan. The image of American weakness was burned into their strategic thinking. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka later admitted that the senior Japanese officers viewed the American soldier with something close to contempt. Not hatred, contempt. As a fighter, the American was underestimated almost completely. That contempt was about to cost Japan dearly. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, were not what Tokyo expected. They were young. Many were teenagers. Some had never fired a shot in anger. They landed on a beach in chaos, with supply ships pulling back early under Japanese air attack, leaving the men ashore with limited ammunition and 4 days of rations. Their situation was immediately precarious. They took the airfield, soon renamed Henderson Field, but they were surrounded by jungle, cut off from easy resupply, and watched from the hills by Japanese forces who began planning their counterattack almost immediately. Colonel Ichiki's regiment was chosen to lead the first major assault to retake the airfield. Ichiki was confident. His men were veterans of the fighting in China. They had crushed Chinese resistance with brutal efficiency. They had trained for years in the art of night assault, fast, quiet, overwhelming. Ichiki reportedly believed that a single powerful night attack would send the Marines running.
He told his superiors the airfield would be recaptured within a matter of hours. He moved his men to the beach, to a sandbar crossing at the mouth of the Ilu River, and he hit the Marine line at midnight. What happened next stunned the Japanese command structure for months. The Marines did not break. They did not retreat. They fell back slightly, tightened their perimeter, and then they destroyed Ichiki's regiment with methodical, grinding violence. Machine guns, artillery, and at dawn, Marine tanks drove into the survivors on the sandbar, and the battle became a slaughter. By morning, over 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors and took his own life, unable to report to Tokyo what had happened, unable to explain it, because he didn't understand it. What Ichiki had encountered, and what many Japanese commanders after him would encounter, was something their training had not prepared them for. Not just American firepower, though that was real. What broke their calculations was American stubbornness. The Marine refusal to quit even when logic suggested they should, even when the situation was desperate, even when they were outflanked, outnumbered in the dark, exhausted and hungry. Captured Japanese documents from this period begin to shift in tone. Early reports describe American forces in clinical, dismissive terms, units and positions, expected behavior. But after Guadalcanal, the language starts to change. Intelligence officers note with evident frustration that Marine units are not behaving predictably, that expected psychological collapse is not occurring, that assault tactics which worked against other opponents are failing against these specific men. One captured document, later analyzed by American military historians, includes the observation that Marine soldiers appear to fight with a personal intensity that goes beyond ordinary military discipline. The Japanese officer who wrote it was trying to explain something he had no cultural framework for. He was trying to describe the Marine Corps' ethos without knowing what it was. General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi learned the same lesson at a higher price. Kawaguchi commanded a larger force, approximately 6,000 men, sent to retake Henderson Field in September 1942. He was an experienced, intelligent officer. He had studied the Ichiki disaster and knew the Marines could not be taken lightly. He planned a complex, multi-columned assault across difficult jungle terrain, timed for the night of September 12th. His plan was tactically sophisticated. He would hit the Marine perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously. If the timing held, the Marines would be overwhelmed before they could consolidate their defenses. He moved his men through some of the most brutal jungle terrain in the Pacific, cutting paths through chest-high grass and dense forest, carrying ammunition and supplies by hand. The Marines were waiting. On a ridge that would become one of the most legendary pieces of ground in Marine Corps history, a place called Bloody Ridge or Eldson's Ridge, after the Marine lieutenant colonel who commanded its defense, a force of approximately 850 raiders and paramarines prepared to hold against thousands. Colonel Eldson walked the line that evening. His men were thin, mosquito-bitten, running on minimal sleep. The jungle below them was silent in the particular threatening way that Pacific jungle goes silent before violence. Eldson told his men simply that this was not the place to die, that the ridge was theirs, that they were going to hold it. The Japanese came at 9 in the evening, and they kept coming.
Wave after wave moved up the ridge through the darkness. Kawaguchi's men screamed in English, insults, surrender calls, anything to unnerve the Marines. Some Marines later said they could hear Japanese officers shouting commands in the jungle below them between charges. The battle lasted through the night. Several times the Japanese broke through the line. Several times the line reformed. Edson moved constantly up and down the ridge, calmly giving orders while bullets moved through the darkness around him. By dawn, Kawaguchi's force had lost over 2,000 men. The ridge held. When Kawaguchi assembled his surviving officers afterward, he made a statement that was quietly recorded and that surfaced decades later in post-war testimonies. He said that in his career he had fought many enemies. He said he had never encountered men who fought the way the Marines fought on that ridge. He was not speaking with admiration, he was speaking with something closer to bewilderment. He had done everything correctly by his military doctrine, and it had not been enough. He was relieved of command shortly after. Tokyo was not interested in explanations. But the question he was asking, the question of why the Marines held when they should have broken, that question was spreading quietly through the Japanese officer corps. The answer, though no Japanese commander fully grasped it, lay in something that cannot be taught in a month or a year. The Marine Corps had spent over a century building a specific kind of soldier, not simply a trained fighter, but a man with an identity. From the moment a recruit stepped onto the training ground at Paris Island, he was being remade. Physically, yes, but more importantly, psychologically. He was taught that he was part of something that had never been defeated in its history. He was told, repeatedly, relentlessly, that surrender was not a category of thought available to him, that the man next to him was counting on him, that the Corps was counting on him, that something larger than his individual life was at stake in every position he held. Japanese warrior culture prized death over surrender, but it was a death oriented around honor, around not failing the emperor, not shaming one's unit, not surviving defeat. The Marine ethos was different. It was not about dying, it was about not quitting. Those are different things. Dying can be done once. Not quitting has to be chosen again and again, in the dark, in the cold, in the mud, with blood on your hands and nothing left in your body. That distinction was invisible to Japanese commanders, but its consequences were visible everywhere. By late 1942, the tenor of Japanese military communication about American Marines had shifted significantly. Lieutenant General Haruyoshi Yakutake, commanding Japanese forces in the Solomons, sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters that pulled no diplomatic punches. He stated plainly that the fighting capability of American Marines had been seriously underestimated, that previous assessments of American psychological fragility had proven incorrect in the field. He was asking Tokyo, essentially, to rethink everything they believed about their enemy. Tokyo did not want to hear it. The Japanese propaganda apparatus was deeply invested in the image of the soft American. Posters, radio broadcasts, official statements, all built on the premise that American boys raised in comfort and democracy lacked the spiritual power of the Japanese warrior. To admit that the Marines were exceptional fighters was not merely a military concession, it was an ideological crisis. It threatened the entire framework of Japanese superiority that the government had used to justify the war to its own people. So officially, the Marines remained underestimated. Officially, Japanese officers reported tactical complications rather than enemy quality. The word came down to find different explanations for battlefield losses: terrain, supply, timing, not the enemy. But in the private correspondence, in the field journals that were captured as the war turned, in the post-war testimonies of surviving officers, a different truth emerges. Captain Toshikazu Romae, a senior naval staff officer, stated after the war that by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, every experienced officer in the Pacific Theater understood that the Marine Corps was the most dangerous land fighting force they faced. Not in terms of numbers or equipment alone, but in terms of what he called fighting spirit, a term he used while acknowledging that the Japanese word for it, seishin, did not quite translate to what he had seen. What he had seen, and what his colleagues had seen, was men continuing to function at a high level under conditions designed to destroy function. Men who had been without food for days, who still organized a coherent defense.
Men who had watched their friends die within arm's reach, who still got up and counterattacked. Men who, according to every theory of human psychological limits, should have surrendered or broken, and who simply did not. The Marines brought something else to the Pacific that Japanese commanders had not anticipated: adaptability. The Japanese military had refined a set of tactics over years of conflict in China and Manchuria. Night attacks, infiltration, human wave assault, psychological pressure. These tactics worked against opponents who operated within predictable frameworks. But the Marines, young, often poorly supplied, operating far from conventional military schools of thought, adapted quickly and in ways that confused Japanese commanders. After the Ilu River disaster, Marines began using different night perimeter techniques, incorporating lessons from the assault into new defensive doctrine within weeks. After Bloody Ridge, Marine units began pre-registering artillery on likely Japanese approach routes, using the terrain itself as a weapon. They learned the jungle at a pace that surprised their opponents, who had expected American fighters to be lost and helpless in that environment. By the time the battle for Guadalcanal concluded in February 1943 with a Japanese evacuation, the campaign had cost Japan over 20,000 dead, hundreds of aircraft, and something more difficult to quantify: certainty. The certainty that they understood their enemy, that they knew how Americans would behave. That confidence, once broken, never fully returned. The island-hopping campaign that followed carried these lessons forward in blood. At Tarawa in November 1943, nearly 1,000 Marines died taking a tiny atoll in 76 hours of combat. Japanese defenders, many of whom were among the best-trained naval infantry in the world, fought from concrete bunkers and fortified positions that were supposed to be impregnable. Their commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, reportedly said before the battle that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to take Tarawa. His exact words may be apocryphal, but the confidence behind them was not. Japanese island defenses were designed with the conviction that American forces would break against them. What happened instead defined the modern mythology of the Marine Corps. Marines waded through chest-deep water under direct machine gun fire. They died on the reef. They died on the beach. They kept moving. Men who reached the shore had no tactical cover, no clear path, no possibility of retreat. Officers and enlisted men in some cases could not be distinguished from each other, both performing the same desperate work of clearing bunkers with grenades and rifles and bare hands. The dead piled up in the water and on the sand, and the living kept going. Japanese survivors of Tarawa, and there were very few, described to interrogators their disbelief at the continued assault. That men could absorb those losses and keep attacking, to them was incomprehensible. The only framework they had for it was the same one their officers had used from the beginning: fanaticism. They called Marines' tenacity a form of madness. It was easier, perhaps, than admitting what it actually was. It was discipline meeting belief. The belief that the mission was achievable, that the man on your left needed you to move, that the Marine Corps did not leave its people behind and did not leave its objectives uncaptured. As the war moved toward its terrible conclusion, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the nature of Japanese defensive strategy evolved because of the Marine threat. By 1944 and 1945, Japanese commanders had abandoned the beach defense model. They had learned painfully that Marines could not be stopped on beaches. Instead, they built their defenses inland, in depth, in caves and tunnels designed to absorb and grind down an attacking force. The strategy was no longer to defeat the Marines outright. It was to make the cost so high that American will would break before Japanese resistance did. That strategic shift was, in its own way, the highest tribute Japanese commanders ever paid to the Marine Corps.
Iwo Jima is the fullest expression of this strange, brutal respect. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was among the most gifted defensive commanders of the entire war. He had spent years in the United States as a military attaché. He spoke English, he had driven across America, had dinner in American homes, had watched American industrial capacity with his own steady eyes. He understood the United States far better than most Japanese commanders. He had reported back to Tokyo years before the war that war with America was a profound mistake and that the material gap between the two nations would be decisive. He was right. And then he was ordered to defend Iwo Jima anyway. Kuribayashi's defensive plan for the island is studied in military academies to this day. He built 36 kilometers of tunnels beneath volcanic rock. He placed his guns in positions designed to be mutually supporting so that no approach could be made on any position without other positions having a clear line of fire. He trained his men to resist specifically the way Marines attacked, to wait out the naval bombardment, to emerge after the barrage, to make every meter of advance cost maximum American lives. His letters home during the preparation of the island's defenses include passages that read more like the words of a man writing to be understood by history than to reassure his family. He wrote that he did not expect to survive. He wrote that he understood what was coming and that he would do his duty. He wrote that he would face the Americans and make the cost of taking the island as high as he could. He also wrote something that his post-war interpreters found striking. He wrote that the Marines coming to his island were not ordinary soldiers, that they were the best fighting men America possessed, that to stop them would require not superior courage, but superior preparation, superior position, and the willingness to die without flinching. He was describing his own men. But the fact that he framed it that way, as a contest between professionals, not between a superior warrior culture and an inferior one, represents something profound. It represents a Japanese commander who had finally, honestly looked at what he was facing and described it accurately. Iwo Jima cost the Marines nearly 7,000 dead and over 19,000 wounded over 36 days of combat. Kuribayashi died on the island. Over 20,000 Japanese defenders died there. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi became the most reproduced photograph in American history. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz said of the battle that uncommon valor was a common virtue. It was the right phrase for what had happened there. But on the other side of that equation was Kuribayashi's assessment, a man who had prepared his entire defense around the understanding that the force coming to kill him was not going to stop. There is a thread running through all of these engagements, from the Ilu River to the black sand of Iwo Jima, from the jungle darkness of Bloody Ridge to the coral and fire of Tarawa. That thread is not technology. It is not numbers. It is not even tactics, though tactics matter. The thread is this. At every point where Japanese commanders calculated that American forces would break, the Marines did not break. That is a simple statement. Its simplicity is deceptive. To hold a perimeter in the dark against an enemy that is not afraid to die requires something that cannot be measured in training schedules or weapons counts. Japanese commanders searched for the right word for it throughout the war and never quite found one. They called it stubbornness. They called it arrogance. They called it madness. Some of them, in private, may have called it what it was. What is it that makes a man hold the line when everything tells him to run? The men who held those lines are mostly gone now. The officers who faced them across jungles and volcanic rock are gone too. But the question lives on in the documents they left behind, in the careful, reluctant words of men trained never to admit fear, admitting something that looked very much like it.
Somewhere in the archived testimony of a Japanese officer who survived the Pacific War, a man who fought at Guadalcanal and Saipan and never received the victory he had been promised, there is a sentence that has stayed with historians for decades. He was asked what he remembered most vividly about fighting against the Marines. He paused. He said that what he remembered most was the silence before they came, not the noise of the battle, the silence just before, because after a while, he said, you understood what that silence meant. It meant they had decided. History records the battles, the islands, the casualty figures, the command decisions. It records the turning points and the names of the men who led them. But underneath all of that, there is this quieter history, written in captured journals and post-war confessions, in the redesigned defenses and the reluctant tributes of commanders who fought these men and knew, in the part of them that was honest, exactly what they had faced. They faced men who had decided. What do you think it was that made the Marines different from every other force the Japanese had encountered? Tell us in the comments, because the men who were there would probably say it came down to something that no training document ever fully captured, something passed from one Marine to the next, on every island, in every jungle, in every moment when it would have been so much easier to stop. They didn't stop.